Oh, good evening. Today it is August the 25th in the year 2011, and this is the 7th episode of the Mobuku Chronicles, which, as the name suggests, is basically to chronicle the continuing disintegration the failure, visible failure of the nation state which we are witnessing, and to go into the whys and wherefores of why and how this smashing itself to pieces of the nation state is necessarily taking place. Now, when I finished off the last episode, I was talking about the use and abuse of drugs. And to recap a little bit, I had stated that from the perspective of the unique principle of yin and yang, if the human individual takes into his or her body those substances which are extremely yang compared to the dynamics of the human organism itself in terms of yin and yang, we are necessarily attracted to consuming substances which are extreme yin. This is unavoidable. And I'd gotten as far as talking about marijuana, cannabis, resin, the weed, and so forth, so I don't need to recap that. But I hadn't talked about heroin and cocaine. So to get that data, I did the research, and this is as of 2008, this data I managed to get off the World Wide Web. 340 tons of heroin are consumed every year worldwide at the cost of $44,300 per kilo. And Canada and the US consumes 22 tons, which approximately amounts to 6%. And that turns out to be 49,280 pounds, 22,353.3 kilos at a cost of approximately $1 billion. And in the cocaine use, the United States, 16.2% of the population uses cocaine. Now, as far as heroin trafficking goes, the biggest by far trafficker of heroin in the world is the US military. Now, from my perspective, I knew that the Vietnam War had been fought over who controls the heroin trade coming out of the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia. And that objective was secured, and so the military withdrew because they had secured their objective, which was to control the heroin traffic coming out of Southeast Asia. Now, Afghanistan is another source of heroin, and the reason why the US military is in Afghanistan is to procure and control that source of heroin from the opium plantations in Afghanistan. And this is actually, I've known this for quite some time, but I wanted to bring it to your attention because it is part, I believe, well, it's not, that's what I actually know to be the case, of the policy to have the vast majority of people under the influence of these extreme substances, whether they be alcohol or cannabis resin, cannabis, the weed, and heroin and cocaine. Now, remembering, of course, that this is part and parcel of this policy to maintain people eating animal protein as their staple intake on a day-to-day basis, because this necessarily sets up the dynamic whereby you are attracted, if we are eating animal protein on a day-to-day basis, we are attracted necessarily to consuming alcohol, cannabis, sativa as it's called, and heroin and cocaine. Now, I'm just talking about the physical dynamics here, just the technicalities. This is what happens. And of course there are profound spiritual reasons why this is going on, and I will get into that at some later date. But now, one of my main sources of information is a very reliable. I have been following his work actually since probably around 2002, and then he went independent in 2004, and his name is Jim Willie, and he puts out a private newsletter which you have to subscribe to, which of course I highly recommend, because this man has been totally reliable and insightful and on the money in most respects with regard to what he has been able to report. Now, his reports are very, very substantial. I mean, he brings them out once a month, and they're usually about 34 pages each, and there's a great deal of information in there, and information which behooves everybody to know. Now, and I've mentioned him in the past, it costs about $18 a month to get a subscription to his newsletter. And in his latest one, talking about this military control of the narcotics, the heroin traffic, 70% of the heroin traffic coming into the West is controlled by the U.S. military. They are narco barons. In other words, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Commander-in-Chief, who is the President of the United States, and the military high command are all narco barons. This is simply a fact. And the amount of revenue that this heroin trafficking brings to the military is between $800 billion and $1.2 trillion per year. That's a substantial amount of money in anybody's book. Now, in 2008, the United Nations issued a report. This was by a department of the United Nations which is responsible for monitoring banking activity. And this report said that it was very clear the money laundering of drug money was taking place on a vast scale. And in fact, if it hadn't been for that drug money laundering through the banking system would have utterly collapsed in 2008. Now, this particular individual who issued this report said, I'm not responsible as part of my job to determine who is doing this. My job is just to monitor the activity, and this is what we have found. Furthermore, the Russian government made a request to NATO to quit using the air bases in Europe as the offloading, shall we say, platforms for the heroin coming out of Afghanistan and the Far East. And they were politely refused. So, Now, here's what Jim Woody has to say in his latest report. Here is a reminder of my September 2008 forecast. Eventually, the U.S. military will split off with the defense contractors and form a private arms producer and dealer. The vast narcotics monopoly would be another large business. As a subsidiary, a third would be mercenary business centered upon Halliburton and Blackwater. These are two American corporations, which you can research on the internet, which would specialize in important violent targets. A fourth business might have to be shut down in due time when the US dollar system finally collapses, which it is actually happening right now. That is counterfeit of US $100 bills, stolen plates from the US Department of Treasury, US Treasury bond counterfeit, sales in duplicate by J.P. Morgan, and Fannie Mae bond counterfeit, one reason for its nationalization. For those who believe such operations are small, permit me to accuse unspeakable naivety and ignorance. No mention will be made here of the 20 different Ford road programs conducted by the U.S. and the Bank of England, of which the Madoff funds was but a small one. Precedent exists as the German military machine became the famous Odessa Corps after World War II ended. It still operates today. Only after an independent spin-off will the U.S. military pay for its own costs entirely. Current costs are almost all paid for by a defense budget considered sacred and above scrutiny. In fact, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when we had that farce a few weeks ago about the debt ceiling debate, such as it was, the Joint Chiefs of Staff made it very clear that the military budget was untouchable. The narcotics element stands as a wild card which earns between $800 and $1.2 billion a year. In profit, the U.S. security agencies, with support from the Pentagon, looks at, acts, and defends itself like a criminal syndicate organization replete with obscene profits. It will continue regardless of the fate of the nation. So that's one thing. Now, the military is not the only institution of the federal government which displays this type of what you might call sociopathic behavior. By no means is it the only institute or bureaucracy, such as, if you could call the military a bureaucracy, that engages in kind of personal profit motive. It happens in every single bureaucracy of the United States government, without exception. And of course it takes place in the banking system, the brokerage houses, the pharmaceutical medical complex. I mean, it's rampant. Now, when we inquire into what is it that makes human beings act in such a manner that they have a complete disregard for the rest of humanity, total and utter disregard. This is called, well, the technical term is sociopathic, but spiritually it is the activity of subhuman beings. That is, human beings that have sunk beneath the status of humanity. And what is the cause of that? Well, I'll talk about that later. But I wanted to go through more of this material that comes out of Jim Woody's latest newsletter. I mean, the reason I quote Jim Woody is because he's the only one that I read that really recognizes what's going on. Now, when he talks about what he talks about, and I'm going to quote a few things here, he seems